want to invite you to reach and grab your copy of God's Word and turn to Nehemiah chapter 5. As we bring you a message today, I bring you a message today entitled, Keep on Mission. You know, if you think about where we've been in this study, as Bo just shared a few seconds ago, man, we have seen in Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah has heard about the people who are back in Jerusalem, that the walls are broken down and they are in distress, they are discouraged, they are hurting, and he, in deep compassion and feeling for his countrymen back in Israel, in Jerusalem, he begins to think, God, how can you use me to help them? Then he realizes, you know, he's got a great position there with the king. He is the cupbearer to the king. And he says, you know, I'm going to take a risk. I'm just going to go into the king and I'm going to say, listen, I'm discouraged. I would love for you to help me out and allow me to go back to my homeland and help my countrymen out. Sure enough, God moves in his heart with prayer and vision as well as commitment. And the king says, Nehemiah, go. Nehemiah goes and he looks at the land and he looks at the wall and he decides, here's what needs to happen for it all to be done. And all the people of Israel come by groups, places, in families as well, and begin to build the wall, and everything is great. But then this shows up. And regardless of what you and I do in life, at some point, in some moment, in some season, conflict will happen. How many of you understand that? If you are out in the world, if you are working in an office, and the office includes more than just you, there will be conflict. How many of you know that? If you have a family, and your family includes more than just you, there will be conflict. How many of you understand that? In a church, have you ever known this? I know it's hard for us to believe. How many of you know from time to time there is conflict that takes place in churches? How do you think in every town we get a Second Baptist church? Because the conflict that used to be in First Baptist Church, right? Then they had a God-ordained business meeting which turned into a church planning, i.e. church split. You know, there is a reality that we're always going to struggle with this. When it comes to this issue, I love God's Word, because it would have been easy for Nehemiah and Ezra, as they're writing, to say, man, God did this and God did this, and everybody loved each other, and they all sang Kumbaya, and they just hugged each other at the end, and everything was great. But God's Word is so honest, it even in the midst of a miracle taking place, stops to tell us, we're still not in the Garden of Eden. We live in a world that is filled with sin, and conflict and confrontation is part of where we're going to be. Now, we're also going to see as we look at Nehemiah chapter 5 that you're going to find conflict among God's people right here rebuilding the wall, but you're going to have conflict in your family, you're going to have conflict at the office, you're going to have conflict sometimes among your friends. Whatever organization you're involved in, you and I are going to find conflict. We're also going to see when we go to Nehemiah chapter 5, the idea that there is a proper way to solve problems. And sometimes we don't follow the right biblical process for solving our problems. Now, if we think, and I'm going to share a little bit more with you in a second, but you know, anytime you're in the midst of some sort of conflict, the best thing to do is try to solve it by yourself. See if you can figure out how to solve the problem by yourself. As a matter of fact, my wife is much better at this than I am. If you go up to any of our kids, and if you begin a sentence and you say, they can finish the sentence. Because my wife is really good as the teacher, that anytime my kids would come, maybe the girls were fighting or the boys were fighting or they were all fighting, they would come to their mom, and her first response was, solve your problem. Put it back in their lap to see if you can solve the problem. Now, usually when they brought their problems to me, I immediately began to try to solve their problem for them. How many of you know what I'm talking about? That's just my nature. I'm that type A. I'm going to fix it. Now, it may not end well for them, but I'm going to fix the problem. She always was much calmer, and she would say, hey, solve your problem. And if you can't truly solve your problem, then I will step in and I will help you solve the problem. And so that's kind of where we go. And so as we think about this, first thing you and I all want to do, if you find yourself, whether it's in your family, maybe even it's with someone at church, it's at the office, or if it's in an organization, start off by trying to solve your problem yourself first. Then if you can't, and what we're going to see here in Nehemiah chapter 5 is you had people who had problems, they didn't have the authority to solve their problems. So then you take it to the proper authorities. If you're in an office situation, you take it to the proper authority. If you don't have the authority to solve the problem, use the proper chain of authority. And then those who are in authority need to solve the problem then the right way. Have you ever taken a problem to someone who had the authority to fix it and they made it worse? We all have, right? I can tell you, after pastoring and serving alongside a number of people over a number of years, there have been times that I have reacted instead of reasoned out my reaction, and I've probably made the problem worse. How many of you know what I'm talking about? My guess is you've done the same as well. And so when we look at Nehemiah chapter 5, the beautiful thing is that God's word doesn't sugarcoat everything. It says right in the midst of this miracle, this vision, that the children of Israel were going to gather together and in 52 days rebuild a wall for God's glory that had been fallen down or had been down for 140 years, and in 52 days they're going to fix it. But in 52 days, everybody say 52 days. They couldn't work side by side for 52 days without having a conflict, without it being brought up. Now, you say, Pastor, what causes conflict? You and I both know this. You put a number of people together. We all have personality types, right? How many of you in here are type A personality? Raise your hand. How many of you are type B? Type A, the competitive, the achiever. Man, I'm going to get it. They are simplifiers. It's just point A, point B. That's where we're going. How many of you are type B personalities, if you've ever taken it? Yeah, type B personalities. You have a tendency to be a little less competitive. You're not quite as big as you kind of like the social environment. You want everybody to go along, to get along, and the type A personality has no time for that. Right? Then you have your type C personality, your type C personality. They're the kind of person that they are always looking to optimize, right? See, these kind of people drive me nuts. They're always trying to look for the best solution. I'm looking for the shortest line between 2 points. And they're coming up with systems and this and that, and if we do this and we do that, and today we're back in NFL, right? The quarterback that is a type C personality is always getting a delay a game because they're trying to figure out the best play that they can run. And there are others, D personalities. How many of you are type D? How many of you are type D? No one. I'm not asking for your grades in high school. How many of you are D? There are those that are D-type personalities, right? I mean, and let me tell you what, the world needs Ds. I want you to know this is a great thing as you think about the D personality. They typically have a very real-world attitude. These people almost never quit. They understand that life sometimes is fair and sometimes is unfair, but they're not going to let it get them down. They're just going to keep trudging ahead. They're going to keep rolling ahead. And that's really where we are. So as we think about today, man, this was not just a personality conflict. And see, and a lot of times you and I need to separate what kind of conflict is this? Is this a personality conflict? Do you just have a type A that doesn't like a B, or a B doesn't like how type A does? If that's really where it is, then you just need to figure out how to meld the personalities together. However, there are other times in our lives that there are real world problems that we can't solve by ourselves. And if we find ourselves in that situation, man, Nehemiah chapter 5 gives us a wonderful pattern on how we should solve our problems. Now, this includes inside the church as well as outside the church, perhaps even with your family and in my family. So what is our job when it comes, if you journey to the New Testament, before we even go back to Nehemiah chapter 5, what is our call on mission as a church? Let's look at Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to put it up on the screen for you. The Apostle Paul, talking to the Ephesian church, he says, make every effort, everybody say every effort, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. All right, there's Paul. He's talking to us as a church, those of us who are online. Our job is to make every effort possible to keep the unity of the Spirit. Now, let me tell you what that verse does not say. It does not say that you and I should make every effort to create the unity in the Spirit. See, that's already been created. See, as a believer, I have the Spirit of God in me, right? We know the fruits of the Spirit, how they should be lived out, how I should flesh the fruits of the Spirit out. And if I have the Spirit of God in me and you're a believer and you have the Spirit of God in you, can the Spirit of God ever be in conflict with the Spirit of God? No. The Spirit of God in me and the Spirit of God in you are never going to be in conflict with each other. However, can my flesh and your flesh ever be in conflict with each other? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. That's why sometimes we'll see in a marriage situation, you'll see this couple that, man, is almost from love at first sight. They loved each other. They end up dating for a long time. They plan this wonderful marriage. They have the beautiful ceremony, and you just think in your mind, that right there is a fairy tale. Why? Because you think, and they lived happily ever after, and then the problem is they didn't live happily ever after. Why? Because the flesh is always there. And so what the Apostle Paul says is our job is not to create unity. It's to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit. Now, that means first thing that I need to be humble, I need to be submissive, I need to make sure that what I say to other people honors God and honors them. That means I need to act right. But it also means from time to time, when things get out of sorts, I have to be willing to deal with conflict. And I have to confront people sometimes. And so the Apostle Paul puts it this way in the New Testament, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit. So what does that look like in Nehemiah chapter 5? Let me give you a couple of principles as we think through this, that there is a real world experience. Here's what you and I need to know, is that we live in a real world and we will, everybody say will, we will encounter conflict. We will. If you are married, you're going to have conflict. If you have kids, multiply the conflict, right? If you go to the office, if you go to work, there's going to be conflict. The bigger your organization is, the more conflict there is going to be. However, there's a right way and a wrong way for us to respond to conflict. Now, let's start off by looking at the conflict that we see in Nehemiah chapter 5. And let me remind you, up until now, everything has been great. Everybody is on the wall. They are working in groups. Nehemiah has the vision. He and his men are working together. So let's look. Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 1. Here's what it says. We will encounter conflict. We have to acknowledge that. So here's the conflict. It's finally showing up. Now the men and their wives, that means everybody, raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. So what does it say? The husbands and wives, the men and women, they've been working. But finally, the men and women, the husbands and wives, the moms and dads have said enough is enough. See, if you all of a sudden, and here's what had happened. For these 52 days, the children of Israel had all banded together and taken up their place on the wall to rebuild. So guess what? During those 52 days, what are you not able to do? You're not able to work out in your fields. You're not able to gather your own food. You're not able to do this, and you're not able to do that, right? So here's what's happening. As they have devoted themselves to the work of God at rebuilding the wall, there are others who are making money off their willingness to commit and serve others. And so as we journey on, he said, some were saying, so here's what they said, The men and women came. They gave a great outcry. What were they saying? Some of them, here was their outcry, we and our sons and our daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. What are they saying? I don't have a lot of money in the bank account. And if I'm working over here on the wall, then maybe someone could help feed me as long as I'm working, all right? And while I'm working, but they're saying instead, people are giving us money, charging us for it, and then burning us up with interest. And so that was their first great outcry. Here's another one. Other people were saying, we are having to mortgage our fields. What are they saying? Sitting here, man, I'm just having to mortgage my fields so I can work on the wall, and our homes to get grain during the famine. They had a famine. They said, man, we've had to mortgage and take second mortgages and third mortgages, and we want to work on the wall, and we are working on the wall. But the facts are we're losing everything. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money and pay the king's taxes on our fields and our vineyards. What are they saying? They're saying, man, I'm being taxed to death. I'm being taxed to death. There's actually a fourth one there. I don't read it. You can read all of Nehemiah chapter 5. Some of them, it was so bad that they were having to sell their sons and their daughters into indentured servitude. In other words, they knew they couldn't pay it back, and they said, I've got to keep working my field. I can never pay it back, but here's my son or here's my daughter. They will start working for you. They will be your servant. And so as you think about that, we need to understand, regardless of what the problems are, they had legitimate problems. And you and I might as well. That creates conflict. Their conflict had to do with money. Essentially, it comes down to money. I need to buy food to eat. I need to have money in the bank account so I can work and volunteer and serve. I need to do all of those things. We will encounter conflict. Second thing you and I need to know, even though in a real world we will encounter conflict, here's the second thought, is problems, our problems, your problems, my problems, our problems as a church, they can be handled correctly. Conversely, they can also be handled incorrectly. I think a lot of times when you see churches in the middle of a big fight or you see families in the middle of a big fight, the problem is no longer the issue. It's how they handle the problem that becomes the greater issue. And so let's notice, I love Nehemiah. He is a great example of how we should handle a problem correctly. And so I would encourage you to open your app up or take some notes here and look at some ideas, because we've already seen that Nehemiah is a great leader, and he's also a great leader even in the midst of conflict when problems arrive. Here's what it says in verse 6. He says, when I heard the outcry, so Nehemiah as their leader says, when I heard their outcry to these charges, I was very angry. I'm going to come back to that here in a second. He goes, I pondered them in my mind, and then I accused the nobles and their officials. So far we've seen some principles. We're going to look at them again in more clarity. But he says, listen, I heard the outcry. I responded with anger. Then I thought about it. What's the best process? Then I went to those who were offending them personally and privately. Then continue to read on. I went to the nobles and officials, and I spoke to them. And I said, you are charging your own people too much interest. He said, so I called together then a large number. Now, he went back to them individually. Apparently, they didn't respond well. So he says, let's take it public to deal with them. Then jump down to verse 9. He said, so I continued, what you are doing is not right. Now, as we think about Nehemiah, although he is a leader, he's somewhat of a politician in this regard. But I want you to know the beautiful thing about Nehemiah here and the great leadership example is Nehemiah was not the leader and not the politician that asked, what's popular? Nehemiah wasn't the kind of leader or politician that said, what's safe? Nehemiah asked the right question. What's the right thing to do? And see, and that's where you and I need to be. We need to constantly be asking ourselves that question. Not what's popular, not what's safe, but what's right. And let me tell you what, Nehemiah is in a precarious position here, because he has seen God do some amazing works. He's seen a pagan king basically say, I'll pay for your work. You just go find the labor. He has seen the people come together and rally together about the vision of what it could be like if we rebuild the walls. And now all of a sudden they are put their shoulder to the work. They are getting after it in groups, side by side, but they still have to eat. And Nehemiah has got to address the conflict. There are times that we can't avoid conflict, that we have to go confront conflict. We have to go and confront problems. But when we do this, we have to do it the right way. So let's look here and just pulling from these words. Let me give you some principles for resolving conflicts that we'll see right here from Nehemiah. Let me give you some principles. First of all, notice it's okay to be angry, but then exercise self-control. Remember what I read a few minutes ago? It says, when Nehemiah heard the outcry of the people, his first response was what? He became very angry. How many of you have ever been very angry? That is not a good way to operate, right? That is not a great way to solve a problem. But if you look in the original Hebrew and even in the English, it says, when I heard the outcry, my first response is I became very angry. But I did not act in my anger. It says I pondered in my mind. What does that Hebrew word pondered into my mind mean? It means I thought to myself, what is the best way to respond? What is the best way to respond? And so you and I need to take Nehemiah's advice here and realize, man, if you hear an outcry or some problem or conflict comes your way or some issue comes your way and it makes you angry, the first thing you and I need to do is step back and not act out of our anger. As I think back over my life in marriage or even as your pastor over 25 years, most of the time, the worst things I've ever said have come in a moment of responsive anger. Am I the only person? That, man, this comes and I just... And then about the time those words leave my mouth, I'm trying to grab them. Am I the only one that ever does that? And I've noticed this, sadly. I don't know about in your life, but I've noticed this. Y'all tell me, there's something about the fact that when you say something, you can't unsay it. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Boy, I can think of a billion things that I would love to unsay. Am I the only person? And usually it's in response and anger. So look at Nehemiah. He says it's okay to be angry. You know, anger is a God-given emotion. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of studies, and you can look at them, that show when people get angry, they become very laser-focused, and they get a lot done. They really do. They get laser-focused. You if you want to watch football today, watch football today. Every once in a while, you ever see a coach just lighten into a player? All of a sudden, that player gets very focused on not doing that again or doing better the next time. At the office, if your boss comes in and says, man, you are missing the timeline, what do you have a tendency to do? Man, you get a little angry and you go after it. So anger is a good thing, but we need to understand if we are going to deal with conflict, we've got to let the anger pass us by, and we have to respond with self-control. The second thing that we see is this. Is that when we speak and address the conflict, I want to speak personally to the person who has created the problem or has hurt me first. Whatever I do in my life, if I am going to deal with the conflict, I will promise you, your best order is go to the person privately first. Now, that doesn't always mean it'll fix the problem, but it'll never make it worse. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Just going with humility and a heart and speaking to them first. So Nehemiah, he hears from the people. They came and make these charges. He calls these nobles and officials, the ones that were causing the children of Israel to sell their land and mortgage their future and buy just food so they can volunteer to serve and to work. And he addresses them personally first. Now, apparently, Addressing them personally did not work, because he then takes it publicly. We're going to see it here in a second. But first, go address them personally. Then, here's the next principle. We see it right here. When you address someone in a confrontational manner, be sure you attack the problem and not the person. Attack the problem and not the person. You say, Pastor, where do you see this? When Nehemiah called them together, what did he say? What you are doing isn't right. What was he attacking? Their actions. He wasn't saying all you guys are sorry. What he was saying is what you're doing, this activity, this action, for you and me in our situation of confronting someone, we might say, you know, when you say that to me, here's how that makes me feel. What are you attacking? You're not attacking them. You're attacking the words they're saying to you, right? Or if you're in a leadership position in your organization, and sometimes you have to call someone in and say, you know, what you're saying to them is out of line. What are you attacking? You're attacking the action, not the person. Because if you attack the person, you're going to escalate the situation. So then, notice, the next thing you do, I love Nehemiah in here. Nehemiah has done a lot of great things. We see him so far. But Nehemiah acknowledges his own faults. See, he doesn't explain much of this. But if you go look in a few of the verses that I left out, Nehemiah says, you know, I and my brothers, we were charging interest too. And he goes, we're going to stop. You know, one of the best things you and I can do if we're going to confront someone who we have a conflict with is acknowledge what you've done to contribute to the problem. And most of the time, we've also contributed to the problem, haven't we? Think about a husband and wife in a confrontation or a conflict or whatever. It very rarely is it just him or just her. It's usually both of them. So if you're going to overcome the conflict that has taken place, and there needs to be a loving confrontation, be willing to acknowledge your own faults. And that's exactly what Nehemiah does. He goes, listen, I and my brothers, got to be honest with you, we've charged some interest. And then here's the last thought. Only take it public when necessary. Only take it public when necessary. This is probably more true today than any other day we've ever had. With the advent of social media and the ability for us to, in angry emotion at 3 a.m, fire off a not so well thought out response. Do you understand what I'm talking about? I had this experience. I actually asked the father. I saw him on campus today. I asked this father, can I share your story? And it was a story that just took place. It was last week. I get an email. And he says, hey, help me know if I did the right thing. And he kind of explained the story. He says, how many of y'all know that we're in the midst of election season? Did y'all know that? Okay, I just wanted to make sure y'all were tapped in or y'all wouldn't get the whole story. That a grandfather, this guy's father, had posted something politically. This guy's granddaughter, had responded politically. They clearly were not on the same page. Dad is off at work minding his own business. But the uncles were not. So the uncles decide to defend grandfather and attack the daughter. Dad comes home. Guess how he responded? Better than I would have. Let's be honest. He forwarded and he says, hey man, here's what's going on. And I was like, oh, that's not good. And he says, here was my response. And I read the response. And I sent an email response back to him. I said, you are banned from ever emailing me again. I said, because it made me cry. It was such a perfect response, an affirming response of loving his dad, but always going to be there for his daughters, regardless of what they thought, taught, or believed. And expressing to his brothers who had attacked his daughter that he loved them and cared for them regardless. And I'm sitting there crying because I'm thinking, as your pastor, I would not have been that kind. And so I said, don't ever email me again. I could be on a Zoom call. That'd be embarrassing, right? There's the pastor crying. You know, I've said it before, and I'll say it from this. You know, he showed way more maturity than I would have. I would have lashed out at somebody or all of them or defriended them all. But I've said this before. I said, listen, attack me all you want. You'll probably get Pastor John Mark. You attack my daughters, you don't get Pastor nothing. You get John Mark. And you're not going to like that. And I thought, man, what an amazing example for me. And I told him that. I said, dude, you did awesome. And so here we are, folks. Listen, if we want to be salt and light, we can have political opinions. We can have political differences. We can have differences of opinion all the time. Do you understand that? That's how God created us. But we don't need to lash out at everybody and attack everybody. If you want to see these same principles laid out for Jesus, you can look to Matthew chapter 18. Because of time, we're not going to go there. But I put them in your insert. They're on your app. Go to Matthew chapter 18 where Jesus says, hey, if a brother's offended you over and over again, go to them personally, then take a couple and go to them, then take it to the church. A lot of times, what do we want to do? Someone offends me, I tell everybody else. That's not the biblical pattern. I want to start by collecting myself, go and attack the problem, not the person, individually before I ever have to go publicly. Here's the third thing we see right here, is people who lead other people ought to set a good example. People who lead other people ought to set a good example. I want you to know, I take it as a high honor as your pastor, that although I know I'm not perfect, I want to be a good example in a lot of areas in my life. And I love what Nehemiah did. He was a good example. Notice as we pick it up reading Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 15, he says, but the earlier governors, those who preceded me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to the food and wine. He goes, their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, I did not act like them. What did he do? He came in, and by the way, you'll see here, and we'll talk over the next couple of weeks, Nehemiah ultimately becomes the governor in that area. Everybody said, man, we want him as our leader. And instead of him continuing the heavy burden of taxation on the people and even the assistants as those who did it before, he says, man, I didn't do that. Why? Because I wanted to honor God. He goes, I was willing to take a little tax just to provide for my needs, but I wasn't about to take too much because that wouldn't honor God. Now, as we go on, he says, instead, I devoted myself to the work on the wall. And not only did I devote myself to the work on the wall, all the men who were with me also assembled alongside for the work on the wall. He goes, listen, I went to work. Everybody I had on my staff went to work. And he goes, we did not acquire any land or anything. All right, remember, he's already acknowledged he took some interest, but he didn't go out and take people's land. Now, as you jump on verse 17, he says, furthermore, then look at his generosity as a leader. 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from surrounding nations. So what is Nehemiah saying? I did my best to be a good example. And you and I need to understand that if we lead organizations, if we lead in places in the office or lead in your family, we need to do everything we can to set a good example. Now, for Nehemiah, his example was, I'm not going to overtax the people. I'm not going to ask the people to work without me being willing to work. I'm not going to have staff who requires more work from other people than they're willing to contribute themselves. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to ask people to be generous to us if I'm not also generous back. And that's good leadership. As a matter of fact, if you really want to know how to hold me accountable as your pastor, I'm going to give you the answer. Go to 1 Peter chapter 5. If you want to know what kind of pastor I need to be and what kind of pastor you need me to be, Let's go read it quickly in 1 Peter chapter 5. We won't linger here long. But in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, Peter says, to the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and as a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed, be shepherds of God's flock. There it is, all right? I want you to know the number one illustration or metaphor that I want to be associated with is a pastor. That's the word shepherd. I want to lead our sheep well. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm always, always a pushover. I always get the chance to play with the sheep. I've got to lead, right? So notice what it says. He says, be the shepherds of God's flock. It's God's flock that is under your care, watching over them. Sometimes I have to protect them, not because you must. In other words, I can't see this as drudgery. I can't say, man, I hate this. Gina shouldn't have to look at me every Sunday morning and said, man, you got to go preach. It's part of the job. I just would willingly. I want to go do it willingly. He says, not because you must, but because you are willing as God wants you to be. He says this, not pursuing dishonest gain. Man, you should never question whether your pastor is using you to put more money in his pocket and build his kingdom. And you never will. You never will. We've got a stewardship team that is built up of laymen and laywomen who determine the budgets in the church, not me. We've got a personnel team made up of men and women. They determine salaries, not me. You're never going to see me come up here and talk about lining my own pockets. That's not what we do. Now continue to read on. He says, not because you must, but willingly, as God wants you to do, not pursuing dishonest gain. This is how you should grade me, but eager to serve. I need to be fired up about serving this congregation, and I am. Not lording it over them or those who have been entrusted to you. Man, I should not be lording it over you. I should be humbly leading you. Then notice what it says, but being examples to the flock. That's what I need to be. And he goes, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Here's what I know, serving as your pastor, my greatest payment is not going to happen here, it's going to happen there. And as your pastor, although I will tell you, and I share it with you all the time, I'm not perfect, my greatest desire is to be a good shepherd. My greatest desire is to lead you. My greatest desire is to lead you willingly and passionately, not pursuing dishonest gain. Because at the end of the day, I want to stand before God. Notice what it says. Remember, it says, be a good shepherd of God's flock that has been entrusted to you. Guess whose flock you are? Not mine. You're God's. Someday, I, as your pastor, will look God in the eyes and give an account for how I took care of you. And my prayer is I'll be able to look and say, I did my best. And he goes, you kind of shocked me how well you did. But that's my desire. And so what does that mean for us? If in a real world we are going to experience conflict, there is a right way to handle it. As a leader and as leaders, we need to handle it well. Here's the forethought, and we see it right here, is we need to stay on mission. The worst thing that can ever happen to an organization, whether it's a company, whether it's a family, whether it's a church, whether it's a life group, the worst thing that can happen is they lose sight of the mission. How many of you know what that means? That we start thinking conflict is the issue or conflict resolution is the issue. No, stay on mission. If you read all of Nehemiah chapter 5, it says after Nehemiah dealt with it, it says it was good with all the people and they went back to work. Everybody say went back to work. Man, we have a conflict, we confront it, we handle it the right way, then we go back to work. Jump to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 9. Here's where we'll close. Here's our mission. And this is the same mission that Jesus gave to his disciples. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and all the villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every form of disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, everybody say the crowds. This needs to be our heartbeat. It was Jesus' heartbeat. He was wanting it to be the disciples' heartbeat. It says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion. Everybody say compassion. He had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. There's that word again. It says, then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. People of God at Cottonwood Creek and those joining us online, regardless of the conflict, regardless of the confrontation, the most important thing we can all do is stay on mission. For them, the mission was to rebuild the walls. For us, it's to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now the worship team's going to come out, and we're going to have an opportunity. You know, typically in pre-COVID days, at the end of each service, we would have our altar team down front. And that people would come at the end of each service and you could pray together. We still can't do that for social distance reasons. But we just wanted to come today with an opportunity, assuming that there are some here, many here perhaps, that you're going through confrontation, where you're struggling with some sort of conflict. Maybe in the midst of this COVID season, your level of commitment and passion for Christ has waned just a little bit. That we want to close today with one song. And if there's something going on in your life that you would just come like to take your position at the altar and pray. Maybe you're going through some difficulty, disease. Maybe you've got a conflict with someone you love. Maybe something else is going on in your life. Maybe you just want to rededicate your heart and your life to Christ. In this song, the song's entitled Nothing Else. You know, for us as the people of God, nothing else matters but to honor God and to serve Him. So you can come to the altar. Maybe there are those of you that you just want to stay there and worship where you are. You just want to create a little space and commit your life to Christ. Maybe you want to stand and sing. Whatever response you feel led by the Spirit to do, you do it right here in this moment, in this season. Don't let anything else stand between you and God. If you need to pray about something, you want to commit your life to Christ, come to the altar. If you want to stay there and worship or pray, do it, because nothing else matters.